November 14th, 1949. 11:42 p.m. Small's Paradise, 7th Avenue. The barrel of the snub-nosed .38 Special didn't shake. It was held by a hand carved from granite, aimed directly between the eyes of the most dangerous man in New York. The distance was less than 4 feet. At this range, a bullet doesn't just kill, it erases. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson didn't blink. He didn't reach for the piece tucked in his waistband. He didn't signal his bodyguards, who were currently frozen by the sudden appearance of 3 other gunmen near the kitchen doors. Bumpy simply lifted a forkful of collard greens to his mouth, chewed slowly, and swallowed. The silence in the club was heavier than the lead in the chamber. 200 patrons held their breath. The jazz band had cut out mid-note, leaving the drummer's hi-hat vibrating in the sudden quiet. This wasn't just a hit, this was a coup. There was $50,000 in cash sitting in the safe at the back of the club the day's take from the numbers racket. But the man holding the gun didn't want the money. He wanted the crown. If he pulled that trigger, the hierarchy of the American underworld would shatter. The truce between Harlem and the 5 families would dissolve into a river of blood running down on 125th Street. "Do it," Bumpy whispered, his voice calm as a librarian's. "Or sit down, but the chicken is getting cold." The gunman tightened his finger on the trigger. The hammer began to rise. 3 weeks earlier, to understand why a man stares down a loaded gun over dinner, you have to understand Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. They called him Bumpy because of a slight deformation on the back of his head, but the nickname was deceptive. It sounded cute. The man was not. By 1949, Bumpy Johnson was not merely a gangster. He was the CEO of Harlem's shadow economy. He was an intellectual who read Nietzsche and history books in his spare time, a chess master who treated the streets like a board, and a warrior who carried a switchblade in a tailored suit. Harlem in the late 1940s was the cultural capital of Black America, but financially, it was a battleground. The policy, the numbers game, was the community's stock market. It generated millions of dollars in nickels and dimes. For decades, it had been black-owned and black-operated. But the Italian mob, specifically the Genovese crime family led by Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano from exile, saw Harlem as a reservoir of untapped profit. It didn't want a piece of the pie. They wanted the bakery. The tension in October 1949 was thick enough to choke on. Dutch Schultz was long dead, but the pressure from the Italians hadn't vanished. It had just become more corporate. They were squeezing the independent bankers. They were demanding higher percentages for protection. Bumpy Johnson stood as the single, unmovable object in their path. He was the buffer. He negotiated with the Italians on 16th Street and protected the bankers on 135. Every day Bumpy walked the streets. He was walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. He knew the Italians were tired of negotiating. He knew they were crunching the numbers. They had calculated that killing Bumpy might be cheaper than paying him. The air in the Lenox Lounge felt different that autumn. The whispers were louder. The eyes watching from parked sedans were colder. The stakes were absolute. If Bumpy fell, Harlem would lose its sovereignty. The neighborhood would become a colony of the Commission, ruled by captains from downtown who didn't care about the people, only the payout. Bumpy wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for the keys to the city. The man chosen to break the stalemate was not a local. His name was Salvatore "Sally Steele" Moretti. He wasn't a boss. He was a mechanic, a fixer. In the hierarchy of the Genovese family, Moretti was the man you sent when you wanted a message to be written in red ink. He had made his bones in the Brooklyn dock wars of the mid-30s. Moretti was terrifying because he lacked the one thing that made Bumpy reasonable, a code. Bumpy was a gangster, but he was a gentleman gangster who funded charities and handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving. Moretti was a shark in human skin. He had allegedly strangled a union boss in Jersey with a piano wire because the man was 5 minutes late with an envelope. He didn't care about politics. He didn't care about race. He cared about efficiency. The mandate given to Moretti was simple: take Harlem. The Genovese capos felt that Bumpy had become too comfortable. They believed his celebrity status at the Apollo Theater and the Cotton Club had made him soft. They were wrong, but arrogance often masquerades as wisdom in the underworld. Moretti brought 12 men with him from Brooklyn. They were heavily armed, disciplined, and hungry. They spent 2 weeks casing Bumpy's routine. They knew where he bought his newspapers. They knew which barber shaved him on 135th Street. They knew he spent his Tuesday nights at Small's Paradise, sitting at the same corner booth facing the door. Moretti didn't just want to kill Bumpy in a dark alley, he wanted to do it at Small's. He wanted to execute the king in his own castle in front of his own subjects. It was a psychological tactic designed to break the spirit of Harlem instantly. The ultimatum wasn't spoken. It was the weight of the .38 caliber pistol he polished every night in a rented room on the Lower East Side. November 14th, 1949. Small's Paradise. The setup was military in its precision. Moretti had paid off the busboy to leave the back service entrance unlocked. He had 2 men stationed in a sedan idling on 135th Street to block any police response. He entered the club at exactly 11:35 p.m. Small's Paradise was the jewel of Harlem. The air smelled of expensive cigar smoke, fried chicken, and heavy perfume. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets glided between tables carrying trays of gin fizzes and whiskey sours. The lighting was low and amber, casting long, dancing shadows against the murals on the walls. It was a sanctuary of joy. At 11:37 p.m., the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, a ripple of unease moving from the entrance toward the stage. Conversations died out. Glasses stopped clinking. Bumpy was sitting at booth 14, a prime spot that offered a view of the entire floor. He was dining with 2 associates, laughing at a joke about a politician. At 11:40 p.m., Moretti and 3 of his soldiers stepped into the main light. They wore long trench coats despite the warmth of the room. The visual was jarring. In a room of tuxedos and evening gowns, the rough wool coats screamed violence. The band leader, a perceptive man, saw the glint of metal. The music stumbled and died. 11:41 p.m. Moretti walked straight to booth 14. His shoes clicked rhythmically on the hardwood dance floor. Click, click, click. The sound was like a metronome counting down the seconds of Bumpy's life. Bumpy's bodyguards, usually sharp, were caught flat-footed. Moretti's men had flanked them instantly, pressing barrels into their spines before they could rise. 11:42 p.m. Moretti stopped at the edge of the table. He didn't say a word. He simply withdrew the .38 special and leveled it at Bumpy's forehead. The metal caught the amber light. "It's over, old man," Moretti grunted. His voice was gravel. "Don't make a mess." Bumpy looked up. He didn't recoil. He didn't freeze. He looked at the gun with the mild annoyance of a man spotting a fly on his soup. "You're interrupting my dinner, Sally," Bumpy said. "I'm interrupting your breathing," Moretti replied. "Stand up. We're going outside." "I don't think so," Bumpy said. He cut a piece of chicken. The tension in the room was physical. It felt like the air pressure had dropped before a hurricane. A woman at a nearby table began to sob quietly, a high-pitched, terrified sound. The scent of fear, sweat, and adrenaline began to mix with the smell of food. 11:43 p.m. Moretti cocked the hammer. The mechanical click echoed like a gunshot. "I said stand up." Bumpy chewed. He took a sip of water. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, folding it neatly and placing it on the table. He looked at his watch. "You have a problem, Sally," Bumpy said softly. "I got the gun. You got the problem." "No," Bumpy corrected him. "You have the gun. I have the time." The room held its breath. Time seemed to warp, stretching that single minute into an hour. Every eye was glued to Moretti's finger. The tendon was white. He was going to fire. The violence was inevitable. It was hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. What Moretti didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson didn't survive Harlem by being faster. He survived by being smarter. Bumpy had anticipated this move 3 months ago. He knew the Italians were getting restless. He knew they would send an outsider, and he knew they would come to Smalls. Bumpy had spent the last week buying insurance, not life insurance, loyalty insurance. 11:44 p.m. Bumpy leaned forward, his chest inches from the gun barrel, his eyes locked onto Moretti's. "3 words, Sally," Bumpy said. His voice dropped an octave, radiating a terrifying calm authority. "The phone. Ringing." Moretti blinked. "What?" "The phone. Ringing." Morty blinked. "What?" "The phone," Bumpy repeated. "Behind the bar. It's ringing. For you." Moretti frowned. He hadn't heard a ring. The room was silent. Then it happened. A shrill, mechanical ring cut through the silence. "Ring!" The bartender, a man named Silas who had known Bumpy for 20 years, lifted the receiver of the heavy black rotary phone on the bar. He didn't speak. He just held it up in the air, the cord dangling, extending it toward the hitman. "Who is it?" Moretti hissed, his eyes darting from Bumpy to the phone. Bumpy smiled. It was a cold, wolfish smile. "It's Frank. He wants to tell you that the deal changed." Moretti's confidence cracked. Frank Costello was the boss. If Frank was on the phone and Moretti pulled the trigger, Moretti was a dead man. But how? How did Bumpy know? The twist was simple and brilliant. Bumpy hadn't called Costello. Bumpy had called Costello's mother earlier that day to arrange a flower delivery for her birthday, and casually mentioned to Frank's associates that he had important information about the feds that he could only give to Frank, and he would be at Smalls at 11:45. Bumpy had baited the boss to call the hitman off, simply by leveraging the paranoia of the mafia. Moretti lowered the gun 2 inches. That was all Bumpy needed. "The ace of spades, Sally," Bumpy said, pointing to the breast pocket of Moretti's trench coat. Confused, Moretti looked down. In that split second of distraction, the dynamic in the room flipped. The kitchen doors burst open, 6 men with shotguns. Bumpy's real security detail, who had been waiting in the freezer, stepped out. "Checkmate," Bumpy whispered. 11:46 p.m. The sound of 12 shotguns racking simultaneously is a sound no man forgets. Clack, clack. Moretti froze. He was surrounded. He looked at the phone held by the bartender, then at the shotguns, then at Bumpy. He realized he had been played. He hadn't walked into a hit. He had walked into a performance art piece directed by Bumpy Johnson. "Pick up the phone, Sally," Bumpy commanded. "Tell Mr. Copham. Costello, you were just leaving." Moretti, pale and sweating, holstered his weapon. He walked to the bar, took the phone, listened for 10 seconds, mumbled a "yes, boss," and hung up. He looked at Bumpy with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. "This isn't over," Moretti spat. "It is for tonight," Bumpy replied, picking up his fork. "Get out of my Harlem." Moretti and his men backed out of the club, eyes darting at the shotguns. As the door closed behind them, the silence lingered for exactly 3 seconds. Then, Bumpy tapped his glass with his fork. "Play," he told the band. The drummer hit the snare. The horns flared. The music returned, louder and more frantic than before. The room erupted into applause, not polite applause, but the relieved, hysterical cheering of people who had just watched a man walk through fire without getting burned. The ripple effects were immediate. By the next morning, the story had traveled from Wenhennett Street to the Bronx. The Italians had sent their best mechanic, and Bumpy had sent him home with his tail between his legs, without firing a shot. The meeting cemented Bumpy's position, not just as a gangster, but as the professor of the underworld. The 5 families backed off. They realized that taking Harlem would cost them more than money. It would cost them their reputation. This confrontation at Small's Paradise illustrates exactly why Bumpy Johnson remains a figure of fascination almost 60 years after his death. Most mobsters lived by the sword and died by it. Bumpy lived by his wits. He understood that true power wasn't about who had the biggest gun. It was about who controlled the information. He turned a lethal situation into a negotiation and won. It reveals Bumpy's core philosophy. The battlefield is in the mind. While Moretti was playing checkers thinking only of the kill, Bumpy was playing 3D chess, manipulating the bosses, the timing, and the environment. There is a tragic irony to the legend, however. Bumpy Johnson survived the mobs. He survived Alcatraz. He survived the fiercest gang wars in American history. But on July 7, 1968, he walked into Wells' restaurant on nearly the same block. He ordered a chicken leg, coffee, and hominy grits. He clutched his chest and collapsed. Heart failure. The man who couldn't be killed by bullets was taken out by his own heart. It's a final, poetic reminder. You can outsmart every enemy in the world, but you cannot outrun time. If you want to understand the mind of the man who ruled Harlem, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you respect the strategy over the violence. Comment below, what would you have done with a gun in your face? Next week, we're diving into the darker side of the story, the real reason Bumpy went to Alcatraz.